The night settled over Pinewood, Tennessee like a thick wool blanket, heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of small town where everyone claimed to know everyone, where front porches stayed occupied until the fireflies came out, and where strangers were measured the moment they crossed the city limits. The air hung thick with the smell of cut grass and something faintly metallic from the old rail yard on the edge of town. Crickets filled the silence with their mechanical song, relentless and indifferent. On the corner of Oak Street and Route 9, beneath a street lamp that flickered with the inconsistency of a dying heartbeat, a little girl sat alone on the curb. Her name was Ruby Mae Thornton. She was 7 years old. She wore a yellow cotton dress that had once been bright but was now faded to the color of old paper. Her brown hair, fine as spider silk, clung to the sides of her damp face. She wasn't wailing. She wasn't throwing a tantrum the way children sometimes do when they want something. She was doing something far quieter and far more heartbreaking. She was crying the way people cry when they've stopped expecting anyone to come. Her green eyes stared at nothing in particular. A worn stuffed rabbit, its left ear nearly detached, its button eye missing entirely, leaving only a small indentation where it had once been sewn, sat in her lap. She clutched it between both hands as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. The rabbit's name was Patches. Ruby pressed him closer to her chest and whispered his name, just to hear something that felt like home. It was 11 o'clock at night, July 23rd, 2024. Ruby had been sitting on that curb for 1 hour and 15 minutes. She had counted the cracks in the concrete, 47 of them spiderwebbing out from where her feet dangled. She had watched two cars pass without slowing, their headlights sweeping over her like searchlights before moving on. She had folded and unfolded the hem of her dress until the fabric began to fray at the edges. And through all of it, she had not moved, because her mother had told her once during a night very much like this one, that when you don't know where to go, you stay where you are. You stay and you wait and you trust that someone will come. Her mother's name was Claire. Claire Thornton, 31 years old, who worked the evening shift at the Pinewood Diner and who always came home by 9:30, who would kiss Ruby goodnight and tuck Patches in beside her and whisper that everything was going to be okay, even when it wasn't. Tonight, Claire had not come home. Ruby understood, in the way that 7-year-olds understand things without fully comprehending them, that something had gone wrong. She didn't know what. She only knew that she had woken up at 10:30 in Mrs. Caldwell's house in the spare bedroom that smelled like lavender and mothballs, and the house had been empty. Mrs. Ruth Caldwell, the elderly woman who lived next door, who always had butterscotch candies in her pockets, and who hummed old hymns while she watered her garden. Mrs. Caldwell, who watched Ruby every evening while Claire worked, who had been doing so for the past 8 months without fail. But tonight Mrs. Caldwell was gone. Ruby had called out for her small voice echoing through the quiet house. No answer came. She had checked every room, her spare feet padding softly on the hardwood floors. Patches clutched against her chest. The kitchen was dark, the living room empty. Mrs. Caldwell's bedroom door stood open, the bed neatly made, untouched. Fear had begun to creep in, then cold and sharp. Ruby had gone to the front door. Locked. She tried the back door. Also locked. She looked out the windows and seen nothing but darkness in the distant glow of street lamps. And then she had remembered what her mother had taught her. If you're lost, if you're scared, if you don't know what to do, go to the place where I would look for you. Stand still and wait. I will find you. Ruby knew that place. Oak Street and Route 9, the corner where her mother sometimes picked her up after school when the diner shift started late. The corner with the big oak tree and the bench and the street lamp that never quite worked right. So Ruby had put on her shoes. She had grabbed Patches, and she had walked 4 blocks through the dark streets of Pinewood, Tennessee, past the Morrison house with its chain link fence, past the empty lot where kids played baseball on Saturday mornings, past the old Baptist church with its white steeple pointing at the stars. 4 blocks alone at night because her mother had taught her to be brave and to trust and to wait in the place where she could be found. Her phone, the old flip phone her mother had given her for emergencies, had been in her pocket when she left Mrs. Caldwell's house. But halfway down Oak Street, when Ruby had pulled it out to call her mother again, her hands had been shaking so badly that she dropped it. The phone had hit the pavement with a sickening crack, the screen shattering, the battery flying out and disappearing into a storm drain. Ruby had stood there for 5 full minutes, staring at the broken pieces, feeling her last connection to safety slip away into the dark. She had no way to call anyone now, no way to tell her mother where she was. She was completely, utterly alone. And now she sat on the curb and she waited. The street was empty. A gas station 3 blocks away threw a pale orange light toward the sky, but nothing moved beneath it. The summer air pressed down on her shoulders like invisible hands. Her legs hurt from walking. Her eyes hurt from crying. But she did not move, because Mama would come. Mama always came. Ruby clutched Patches tighter and tried to remember the last thing her grandmother had said to her before she died. It had been 2 years ago, and Ruby had been only 5, but she remembered it clearly because it was important. Ruby May, her grandmother, had whispered, her voice thin and papery, "When I'm gone, you hold on to Patches. He'll keep you safe. He'll remind you that you're loved. And when you're scared, you talk to him, and he'll help you remember that you're braver than you think." Patches had been a gift from her grandmother, hand-sewn with mismatched button eyes and ears that flopped at different angles. One of those eyes was gone now, lost somewhere in the months and years since, but it didn't matter. Patches was still Patches, still safe, still home. Ruby whispered to him now, "Patches, where's Mama?" The rabbit, of course, did not answer. "I did what she said. I came to the place. I'm waiting." The cricket song grew louder, or maybe it was just that everything else had gone quiet. "I'm scared, Patches. And I broke my phone. I can't call anybody." A breeze moved through the oak tree above her, rustling the leaves. It sounded almost like someone shushing her, telling her it would be okay. Ruby wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She would not give up. She would not leave. She would wait, just like Mama said. And then she heard it. At first it was so faint she thought she might be imagining it. A low rumble, distant and indistinct, like thunder rolling across a faraway horizon. But the sky was clear. No clouds. No rain. The sound grew. It wasn't thunder. It was something else. Something Ruby had never heard before. A deep, thrumming roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It started at the edge of the world and grew until it filled the air, until it vibrated in her chest, until it was all she could hear. Ruby looked up. Down Route 9, coming from the east, a light appeared. Then another, then dozens, hundreds, headlights. The roar grew louder, and Ruby understood what it was now. Motorcycles, not one or two, but a river of them, a flood of chrome and steel and thunder rolling through the night like a storm that had chosen to arrive low and slow and deliberate. Ruby's eyes widened. She pressed herself back against the curb, clutching Patches so tightly her knuckles turned white. The first motorcycle appeared under the street lamp, and then another, and the roar became deafening. 300 engines, all rumbling in unison, all moving together like a single living thing. Ruby had never seen anything like it. The motorcycles filled both lanes of Route 9, stretching back as far as she could see. Big machines with gleaming chrome and leather saddlebags. Riders in black jackets and boots, their faces hidden behind helmets or shadowed by the night. They looked like giants, like something out of a storybook. Dangerous and powerful and utterly terrifying. Ruby wanted to run, but she didn't, because Mama had said to stay, to wait. The lead motorcycle, a massive black and chrome machine, slowed as it approached the corner. The rider, a large man with broad shoulders and arms covered in dark ink, turned his head and looked directly at Ruby, and then he stopped. Just stopped right there in the middle of the road, his boot coming down heavy on the asphalt. Behind him, like dominoes falling in reverse, the other motorcycles slowed and stopped as well. One after another, until all 300 machines sat idling in the street, their engines ticking and rumbling, their headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The silence that followed was almost as loud as the roar had been. Ruby sat frozen, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The man on the lead motorcycle swung his leg over and stood. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with a thick, gray-streaked beard and arms that looked like they could break trees in half. Tattoos covered every inch of visible skin, dark designs that Ruby couldn't make out in the dim light. He wore a black leather vest over a dark shirt and boots that looked older than Ruby herself. He was, with question, the most intimidating person Ruby had ever seen, and he was walking toward her. Ruby's breath caught. She pressed herself harder against the curb as if she could somehow disappear into it. Patches was crushed against her chest, his one remaining button eye staring blankly at the approaching stranger. The man stopped a few feet away. He didn't loom over her. He didn't tower. Instead, he did something Ruby did not expect. He sat down. Right there on the curb next to her, lowering himself slowly until he was at her level. His knees creaked slightly, the way grown-up knees do. He let out a long breath and looked out at the street, as if sitting on curbs at 11 o'clock at night was the most natural thing in the world. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Ruby stared at him, her tears still wet on her cheeks, her breath coming in small, hitching gasps. And then the man spoke. "Hey there, little darling." His voice was deep and rough, but there was something gentle in it, a softness that didn't match the beard or the tattoos or the size of him. It was a Tennessee drawl, slow and deliberate, the kind of voice that didn't rush. "You okay?" Ruby didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice had disappeared somewhere in her chest. The man didn't press. He just sat there waiting. Behind him, the other riders had started to dismount. Slowly, carefully, they stepped off their machines and stood in the street. None of them spoke. None of them moved aggressively. They simply stood like sentinels watching. The man on the curb reached up and pulled off his helmet, revealing a weathered face lined with age and experience. His eyes were a pale blue, the kind that looked like they'd seen a lot but hadn't lost their kindness. He set the helmet down beside him. "My name's Sterling," he said. "Sterling Reed, what's yours?" Ruby's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sterling didn't seem bothered by this. He just nodded as if her silence was answer enough. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." He glanced down at Patches still clutched in Ruby's small hands. "That's a fine-looking rabbit you got there," he said. "What's his name?" Ruby's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Patches." Sterling nodded solemnly as if she just shared something very important. "Patches. That's a good name. Strong name." He paused, then added, "Looks like he's missing an eye." Ruby nodded, her grip on Patches loosening just slightly. He lost it," she whispered, "a long time ago." "Well," Sterling said, "I reckon he's still doing his job just fine, even with one eye. Some of the best folks I know are missing a piece or two." Ruby looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face. Are you gonna hurt me?" The question hung in the air, small and fragile. Sterling's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that looked like pain. "No, darling," he said quietly. "I'm not gonna hurt you. None of us are. We're just passing through." He paused. "But I need to know, are you out here alone?" Ruby nodded, the tears starting to come again. "I can't find my mama." The words broke something open inside her, and suddenly she was crying again, harder. This time the kind of crying that comes from deep in the belly and can't be stopped. Sterling didn't reach for her. He didn't try to hug her or pat her shoulder or tell her to stop. He just sat there steady and solid, letting her cry. When the sobs finally began to slow, he spoke again. "Okay," he said, "we're gonna find her." Ruby looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. You promise." Sterling met her eyes. "I give you my word, Ruby May." Ruby blinked. I didn't tell you my name." Sterling smiled just a little. "You just did." And despite everything, despite the fear and the tears and the confusion, Ruby felt the tiniest flicker of something that might have been hope. Sterling stood up slowly, his knees protesting, and looked back at the rows of motorcycles and riders filling the street. He raised one hand, a simple gesture, and immediately two men stepped forward. The first was young, probably in his mid-20s, with close-cropped red hair and a face that still carried the openness of someone who hadn't yet learned to close himself off from the world. He wore a jacket with a patch that read USMC on the shoulder. The second was older, maybe in his 50s, with a gray ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses that seemed out of place on someone wearing so much leather. Sterling gestured to the younger man. "This here's Wyatt Briggs," he said. "He's good people." Then to the older man, "And that's Hank Mercer. He's got 3 daughters of his own, so he knows a thing or two about little girls." Wyatt stepped forward and crouched down next to Ruby, just like Sterling had. He smiled, and it was a warm, genuine smile. "Hey there, Ruby May," he said. "Mind if I sit with you for a minute?" Ruby looked at Sterling, who nodded. She looked back at Wyatt and gave a tiny nod. Wyatt sat down on the curb on her other side, leaving her between him and Sterling. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something wrapped in foil. "I got a granola bar here," he said. "Peanut butter chocolate chip. You hungry?" Ruby hesitated, then nodded again. Wyatt unwrapped the bar and handed it to her. Ruby took it with both hands the way children do when something matters, and took a small bite. It was the first thing she'd eaten since dinner, hours and hours ago. "Good?" Wyatt asked. Ruby nodded, chewing slowly. As she ate, Wyatt's eyes lingered on her face, on the way she held patches on the tears still drying on her cheeks. Something tightened in his chest, something old and painful. She looked so much like Emily, his little sister, who had been 7 years old the last time he'd seen her truly happy, before the drugs, before the overdose that had taken her at 19. Emily, who used to carry a stuffed bear everywhere, who used to wait on the porch for him to come home from school. Wyatt had promised to protect Emily, and he had failed. He would not fail this little girl. Sterling was talking quietly to Hank, now his voice too low for Ruby to hear. Hank nodded and walked back toward the motorcycles. Within moments, 3 riders broke away from the group and headed off in different directions, their engines roaring briefly before fading into the distance. Sterling came back and sat down again. "Hank's sending some folks to check on a few things," he said. "Make sure we can find your mama. You said she works at a diner." Ruby swallowed her bite of granola bar. "The Pinewood Diner," she said, "on Main Street." "And what's your mama's name?" "Claire. Claire Thornton." Sterling nodded and pulled out a cell phone, old and battered, from his pocket. He typed something, then made a call. He spoke quietly, giving instructions, asking questions. Ruby couldn't hear everything, but she caught enough. Someone was going to the diner. Someone was checking her house on Cedar Lane. Someone was calling the local hospital. Sterling was organizing a search, calm and methodical, like it was the most natural thing in the world. When he hung up, he looked at Ruby. "We're going to find her," he said again. "But while we're waiting, can you tell me what happened? Why are you out here by yourself?" Ruby took another bite of granola bar, thinking. "I was at Mrs. Caldwell's house," she said. "She watches me when Mama works. I was asleep and then I woke up and she was gone. The house was empty." Sterling frowned. "Mrs. Caldwell just left you there." Ruby shook her head. "I don't think she meant to. Something must have happened." Sterling exchanged a look with Wyatt. "Okay," Sterling said. "And you walked here by yourself?" Ruby nodded. "Mama told me if I ever get lost, I should go to the place where she would look for me and wait. This is that place. She picks me up here sometimes." She paused, looking down at her empty hands where her phone should have been. "I had my phone, but I dropped it. It broke. The battery fell in the drain." Her voice got smaller. "I couldn't call anybody." Sterling's expression softened even further, if that was possible. "That was real smart, Ruby May. Coming to the place your mama would look. Real smart." Ruby looked down at Patches, at his missing button eye and his worn, faded fur. "My grandma gave me Patches," she said quietly, "before she died. She said he'd keep me safe." "And has he?" Sterling asked. Ruby thought about it. "Yeah," she said. "He has." Wyatt, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. Ruby May, can I ask you something? She looked at him. Are you scared of us, I mean? All the motorcycles and all the people. Ruby considered this. It was a fair question. She had been scared, terrified, even when she'd first heard the roar and seen the headlights. But now, sitting between Sterling and Wyatt, with 300 men standing quietly in the street around her, she realized something. Not anymore, she said. Why not? Wyatt asked, genuinely curious. Ruby looked up at Sterling. Because he sat down, she said simply. Sterling blinked, and for a moment something flickered across his face that might have been emotion he didn't want to show. He didn't stand over me, Ruby continued. He sat down, next to me, like, like we're the same. Wyatt smiled, and it was a sad, understanding smile. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, that sounds like Sterling. Behind them, the street was beginning to change. The riders, all 300 of them, had formed a loose perimeter around the corner of Oak and Route 9. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present, watching. Some sat on their bikes. Others stood in small groups talking quietly. A few had pulled out water bottles or cigarettes. It was almost midnight now, and Pinewood was starting to notice. Lights had come on in houses along the block. Curtains twitched. Doors opened a crack and then closed again. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and then inevitably the police arrived. The cruiser came slowly, no siren, just lights flashing red and blue across the facades of the nearby houses. It pulled up to the edge of the street and stopped. The engine cut off, the door opened. A man stepped out. He was lean and weathered, somewhere in his 50s, with a face like tanned leather, and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years looking into the Tennessee sun. He wore a tan uniform with a badge that read Deputy, and his hand rested not on his gun, but near it. His name was Everett Kane, and he'd been with the Pinewood Police Department for 26 years. Kane stood by his cruiser for a moment, surveying the scene. 300 motorcycles, 300 men in leather and denim, and in the middle of it all, a little girl in a yellow dress sitting on a curb eating a granola bar. It was not what he'd expected when the call came in. Kane walked forward slowly, his boots scuffing against the asphalt. His eyes moved from the bikes to the men to Sterling, who had stood up to meet him. The two men faced each other across an invisible line. Evening, Kane said. His voice was cautious but not hostile. Evening, Deputy, Sterling replied. Kane's eyes flicked to Ruby, then back to Sterling. Got a call about a disturbance. 300 bikers on Oak Street. We're not disturbing anything, Sterling said evenly. We stopped to help a child. Kane looked at Ruby again, really looked at her this time. He saw the tear-streaked face, the worn stuffed rabbit, the yellow dress and the bare legs dangling off the curb. That child got a name, Kane asked. Ruby May Thornton, Sterling said. Her mother's Claire Thornton. Works at the Pinewood Diner. Little girl was out here alone. We're trying to locate her mother. Kane absorbed this. He stepped closer and crouched down, not quite sitting like Sterling had, but lower so he could meet Ruby's eyes. Ruby, he said gently, you okay? These men treating you all right? Ruby looked at Kane, then at Sterling, then back at Kane. They gave me food, she said, and they're helping me find my mama. Kane nodded slowly. He stood up and pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Kane. I need you to run a check on a Claire Thornton. Works at Pinewood Diner. Also check with the hospital, see if there's been any admissions tonight involving a Ruth Caldwell. The radio crackled. Copy that, Deputy. Kane looked at Sterling. You the one in charge here. Chapter President, Sterling said. Iron Ridge Riders. We're on our way to Cookville for the annual rally, just passing through. Kane's eyes swept over the rows of motorcycles again. That's a lot of folks just passing through. It's a tradition, Sterling said. Once a year, the whole chapter rides together, all 318 of us. Kane seemed to process this. He looked back at Ruby. You warm enough, sweetheart? You need anything? Ruby shook her head. I'm okay. Wyatt, still sitting beside her, spoke up. We've been keeping her company, sir. making sure she's safe. Kane studied Wyatt taking in the USMC patch, the young face, the earnest expression. You military Marines, sir, 2 tours. Kane nodded, something shifting in his expression. Not quite approval, but a recalibration, a recognition. The radio on his belt crackled to life. Kane, this is dispatch. We've got a Ruth Caldwell admitted to Pinewood General at 9:15 tonight. Stroke. She's stable but sedated. Kane picked up the radio. Copy. Any family contacted? Negative. No immediate family listed. Kane frowned. He looked at Ruby. Mrs. Caldwell's at the hospital, honey. She had a medical emergency. That's why she wasn't there when you woke up. Ruby's eyes widened. Is she okay? She's going to be fine, Kane said, though he didn't actually know that for sure. But that means you were left alone, and your mama doesn't know yet. Ruby's lower lip trembled. Where's my mama? We're working on that, Kane said. Sterling's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, read the screen, and looked at Kane. My guys just checked the diner. Manager says Claire clocked out at 9:15. Earlier than usual. She got a phone call that upset her and left in a hurry. Didn't say where she was going. Kane's frown deepened. In her car, not at the diner, not at her house on Cedar Lane either. Kane and Sterling looked at each other, and an understanding passed between them. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something more complicated. Kane pulled out his own phone and made a call. Sheriff, it's Kane. I'm on Oak Street. We've got a situation. He listened for a moment, then spoke again. Yes, sir, 300 of them. But that's not the issue. We got a missing woman and her 7-year-old daughter, Claire Thornton. I'm going to need you out here. Another pause. Yes, sir, I know what time it is. He hung up and looked at Sterling. Sheriff's on his way. Sterling nodded. We'll wait. Kane seemed about to say something, then stopped. He looked at Ruby, who was watching all the adults with wide, worried eyes. Ruby, Kane said gently, everything's going to be okay. We're going to find your mama. I promise. Ruby clutched Patches tighter. Mr. Sterling already promised that too. Kane glanced at Sterling, who met his eyes steadily. Then I guess we'd better make sure we keep that promise, Kane said. The streets settled into an uneasy waiting. The bikers remained where they were, quiet and patient. A few had started talking among themselves in low voices. One group had produced sandwiches from somewhere and were eating with the ease of people entirely comfortable with unexpected delays. Ruby finished her granola bar. Wyatt asked her if she wanted another, but she shook her head. I'm okay, she said. Wyatt smiled. You're a tough kid, you know that. Ruby didn't feel tough. She felt small and scared and very, very tired. But she didn't say that. Instead, she asked, Mr. Wyatt, were you really a soldier? Marine, Wyatt corrected gently. But yeah, I was. Did you help people? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. I tried to, he said finally. Is that why you stopped? Ruby asked. To help me. Wyatt looked at her, and his eyes were suddenly bright like he might cry. She reminded him so much of Emily. The same age, the same scared but brave expression, the same way of holding on to something soft for comfort. Yeah, he said, his voice thick. Yeah, Ruby May, that's exactly why. Ruby reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapped around his much larger ones. Thank you, she whispered. Wyatt squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. This is what we do. Ruby looked around at all the men, all the motorcycles, all the quiet strength surrounding her. Are you all soldiers? Sterling, who had been standing nearby, sat back down on the curb. Not all of us, he said, but a lot of us are. Where I mean, we served our country and now we ride together. It's a brotherhood, a family. Ruby thought about this. I don't have a daddy, she said suddenly. He left when I was 4. Sterling's expression softened. I'm sorry, Ruby May. That must be hard. Ruby shrugged a gesture that tried to pretend it didn't hurt. Mama says some people aren't strong enough to stay, But that's okay because we have each other. Your mama sounds like a smart woman, Sterling said. She is, Ruby said fiercely. She works really hard every day, and she always comes home. Always. Except tonight, Sterling said gently. Ruby's eyes filled with tears again. Something's wrong. I know it. Mama wouldn't just... She wouldn't leave me. We know, Sterling said. That's why we're here. We're not leaving until we find her. Ruby looked up at him, this big, intimidating man with his beard and his tattoos and his worn leather vest. Why? She asked. You don't even know me. Sterling was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. Because you're 7 years old, Ruby May, and you were sitting alone on a curb in the dark crying. And there is nothing in this world, nothing that was going to make me ride past that. Ruby stared at him. You're a good man, Mr. Sterling. Sterling looked away, and Ruby could have sworn she saw his jaw tighten. I try to be, darling. I surely try. The sound of another vehicle approaching made them all turn. This time it wasn't a police cruiser. It was a pickup truck, old and rusted with a county seal on the door. Sheriff Colton Hayes had arrived. He stepped out of the truck, and even in the dim light, Ruby could see that he was not happy. He was a heavy-set man in his early 60s with a thick mustache and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He wore civilian-clothes jeans and a flannel shirt, but he moved with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. Kane walked over to meet him, and the two men spoke in low voices. Hayes kept looking over at the motorcycles, his expression growing darker with each passing second. Finally, he walked towards Sterling. Ruby felt Sterling tense beside her just slightly. Hayes stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms. You the leader of this group? Chapter president, Sterling said, standing. Sterling Reed. Hayes looked him up and down, taking in the vest, the tattoos, the beard. Mr. Reed, Hayes said, and the way he said it made it sound like an insult. I appreciate that you may have stopped to help the child, but this situation is now in the hands of law enforcement. I'm going to need your group to clear the street. Sterling met his eyes. With respect, Sheriff, we'd like to make sure Ruby's settled before we move on. Hayes's jaw tightened. That's not your concern. The child will be placed in protective custody until we locate her mother. That's proper procedure. Proper procedure, Sterling repeated slowly. You want to take a scared 7-year-old girl and hand her over to strangers while we ride away. I want you to follow the law, Hayes said, his voice rising slightly. Ruby, still sitting on the curb with Wyatt, felt her heart start to pound. The two men were arguing about her, and it was making everything feel wrong again, like the safety she'd felt just moments ago was about to evaporate. Sterling took a slow breath. Sheriff, she's terrified. She's been alone for hours. Maybe procedure could wait 20 minutes. Hayes stepped closer. Mr. Reed, I'm going to ask you one more time. Move your group, now. The air on Oak Street went very, very still. 300 bikers who had been sitting or standing in relaxed postures suddenly straightened. Not aggressively, not threateningly. They simply became alert, aware, ready. Ruby felt Wyatt's hand tighten slightly on hers, and then she did something she would remember for the rest of her life. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, and she still clutched patches in one arm, but she stood up and she walked forward right into the space between Sterling Reed and Sheriff Colton Hayes. She looked up at the sheriff, this big, angry man who wanted to send her away with strangers, and she spoke. Please don't hurt them. Her voice was small but clear. Hayes looked down at her, startled. Please, Ruby said again. They're my friends. They gave me food. They kept me safe. They're good people. Hayes's expression flickered just for a moment. Sweetheart, these men are heroes, Ruby interrupted, and there was a strength in her voice that surprised even her. My mama taught me that good people help when you're scared. These men help me. The street was silent. Deputy Kane, standing off to the side, felt something tighten in his chest. Sterling behind Ruby didn't move, didn't speak. Ruby looked up at Hayes with her wide green eyes still wet with tears. You're supposed to be a hero too, aren't you? That's what the badge means, right? Hayes stared at her, and somewhere deep in the hard, closed-off places of his heart, something cracked. He looked at Sterling. He looked at the 300 men standing quietly in the night. He looked at Deputy Kane, who was watching him with an expression that was hard to read. And then he looked back at Ruby, this tiny 7-year-old girl in a faded yellow dress, holding a worn stuffed rabbit with a missing eye. Sheriff, everyone turned. A car was coming down Oak Street, a blue Honda Civic with a cracked rear tail light, driving slowly like the person behind the wheel wasn't sure if this was the right place. The car stopped. The door opened. A woman got out. She was 31 years old with Ruby's same brown hair and something in her face that was equal parts exhaustion and terror. Her clothes were rumpled, her eyes red, her hands shaking as she looked at the scene in front of her. The police, the motorcycles, the sheriff and the deputy, and Sterling Reed. And then her eyes found the small figure in the yellow dress. Ruby. The scream tore out of her throat, raw and desperate. Ruby turned. Mama! And then she was running. Patches clutched to her chest, her little legs pumping as fast as they could go. Claire Thornton dropped to her knees on the asphalt and caught her daughter in her arms, and the force of that embrace, the sheer relief and love and terror in it was enough to make grown men look away. Ruby buried her face in her mother's shoulder and sobbed. Claire held her and rocked her and whispered, I'm here, baby. I'm here. I'm so sorry I'm here. Sterling Reed watched from where he stood and then felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Behind him, Wyatt Briggs wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Deputy Kane cleared his throat and looked up at the sky. Even Sheriff Hayes stood very still, watching the reunion, his arms slowly uncrossing. The street was silent, except for the sound of a mother and daughter holding each other like they would never let go. And in that moment, Ruby Mae Thornton understood something important. She had waited, just like Mama taught her, and Mama had come, just like she promised. The reunion lasted only a moment before the procedural machinery of law enforcement reasserted itself. Deputy Kane approached Claire Thornton gently, his hand extended, but not demanding, his voice low and respectful. Claire looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her arms still wrapped around Ruby like she might disappear if she let go. Ma'am, Kane said quietly. I'm Deputy Everett Kane. We need to ask you some questions. Claire nodded, unable to speak, and let Kane guide her toward his cruiser. Ruby wouldn't let go of her hand, and no one suggested she should. They walked together, mother and daughter, fingers interlaced so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Sheriff Hayes stood at a distance, watching his expression unreadable. Sterling Reed remained where he was near the curb, giving them space. Behind him, the Iron Ridge Riders waited with the kind of patience that comes from men who have learned that some things cannot be rushed. Kane pulled out a small notepad. Ms. Thornton, can you tell me what happened tonight, where you've been? Claire's voice came out shaky, broken in places. I was at work, at the diner. My shift was supposed to end at 10:30, but I got a call around 9. She stopped her breath, hitching. What kind of call? Kane asked gently. Claire looked down at Ruby as if debating whether to say it in front of her. Ruby looked back up at her mother with those wide green eyes, and Claire made a decision. Her daughter deserved the truth. From my ex-boyfriend, she said, Derek Vaughn. Kane wrote the name down. Go on. Derek and I dated for about 8 months. I ended it in November. He wasn't a good man. He drank, he got angry. He put his hands on me 3 times before I finally left. Ruby's fingers tightened around her mother's hand. Claire continued, her voice steadier now, as if saying it out loud was giving her strength. I've been trying to get away from him ever since. I changed my number twice. I blocked him on everything. But he kept showing up. At work, at the grocery store, at Ruby's school. Did you file a restraining order? Kane asked. Claire laughed, but there was no humor in it. I tried. I went to the police station in April. I was told there wasn't enough evidence, that unless he actually hurt me again, There was nothing they could do. Kane's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He thought of his own daughter, 28 now, and living in Nashville, who had called him crying 3 years ago about a boyfriend who wouldn't take no for an answer. Kane had driven 4 hours that night and sat on the man's doorstep until sunrise, his badge visible, his message clear. The boyfriend had never called again. Kane had broken protocol that night. He would do it again in a heartbeat. Tonight, Claire went on, he called from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, he said he was outside my house. Outside the house where I thought Ruby was sleeping. Her voice broke on her daughter's name. I panicked. I left work immediately. I didn't even clock out properly. I drove to the east side of town to an old apartment complex where Derek used to have a friend. I thought if I could lead him away, if I could keep him away from Ruby. She trailed off. But I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know Ruth had been taken to the hospital. I didn't know Ruby was alone. I thought she was safe at Ruth's. I thought I was protecting her by leading Derek away. Ruby pressed closer to her mother. It's okay, Mama, she said softly. You were protecting me. Claire looked down at her daughter and fresh tears spilled over. I drove around for almost 2 hours, she said, trying to make sure he wasn't following me back, trying to call my cousin in Nashville who never answered. I didn't know what to do. And then I came home and the house was empty and Ruth's house was locked and I lost it. How did you know to come here? Kane asked. I didn't, Claire said. I drove everywhere, the park, the school, every place I could think of. And then I remembered this corner where I sometimes pick her up and I thought maybe she couldn't finish. Kane nodded slowly. And Derek Vaughn, where is he now? I don't know, Claire said. I thought I'd lost him around 10:30. I haven't seen his truck since. Kane glanced at Sheriff Hayes, who had moved closer during the conversation. Hayes's expression had changed. The anger from before had been replaced by something harder to read. Not quite sympathy, but a kind of recognition. The acknowledgement that he had made assumptions that were proving to be wrong. Ruby, who had been listening to every word, spoke up suddenly. Mama was trying to keep the bad man away from me. Everyone looked at her. That's what happened. Ruby said, her voice small but certain. Mama wasn't leaving me. She was protecting me. Claire pulled Ruby into another fierce hug. Sterling Reed, still standing near his motorcycle, had heard every word. He turned to Wyatt, who had come to stand beside him. Derek Vaughn, Sterling said quietly. You know that name? Wyatt shook his head. But I know the type. Sterling nodded grimly. One of the riders who had gone to check Claire's house came walking back, a tall man with a gray ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses. Hank Mercer. He approached Sterling and spoke in a low voice. No sign of anyone at the house, but there's fresh tire tracks in the dirt driveway. Big truck by the look of it, and one of the neighbors said they saw a green pickup circling the block around 9:30. Sterling's jaw tightened. He's looking for her. Hank nodded. That'd be my guess. Sterling walked over to where Kane and Hayes were standing with Claire. He kept his distance respectful, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Deputy, he said, Sheriff, I don't mean to intrude, but I think you should know something. Hayes turned his expression guarded. What's that? One of my men checked Ms. Thornton's house. There's fresh tire tracks, big truck, and a neighbor reported seeing a green pickup circling the area. Claire's face went pale. That's Derek's truck, she whispered. Dark green Ram. Hayes looked at Kane. Get a description out to all units. I want that truck found. Kane nodded and stepped away, speaking into his radio. Ruby, still holding her mother's hand, was watching everything with the focused intensity of a child trying to understand adult problems. She could feel her mother's fear, could see it in the way Claire kept looking over her shoulder, in the way her hand trembled. Sterling crouched down so he was eye level with Ruby. Ruby May, he said gently, you and your mama are safe here. You understand, all these men, we're not going anywhere until we know you're safe. Ruby looked at him, then at the rows of motorcycles, the 300 riders standing quietly in the night. Why with them? she asked, and it was the same question she'd asked before. Why are you helping us? Sterling was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally. And because a long time ago, someone helped me when I needed it, and I made a promise to myself that I'd do the same for others. Ruby reached out and touched his hand, her small fingers resting on his weathered knuckles. You're like a guardian angel, she said, except with a motorcycle. Sterling's eyes grew bright. I don't know about that, darling, but I do know this. Nobody's going to hurt you or your mama while we're here. Ruby believed him. Behind them, Sheriff Hayes was having a conversation with Deputy Kane that was growing heated. I don't care what your opinion is, Hayes said, his voice low but sharp. This is still my jurisdiction, and I'll handle it how I see fit. With respect, sir, Kane said, those men have done nothing wrong. They found a lost child and they helped her. And right now, with Derek Vaughn somewhere out there, maybe having 300 witnesses isn't such a bad thing. Hayes's jaw worked. They're bikers, Kane. 300 of them. In the middle of a residential street at midnight. This isn't normal. No, Kane agreed, it's not. But neither is a 7-year-old girl sitting alone on a curb because her mother was running from an abusive ex. Nothing about tonight is normal, Sheriff. Hayes looked at him sharply. What's your point? My point is that maybe just this once we don't run off the people trying to help. Hayes stared at his deputy for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Sterling Reed, at the Iron Ridge Riders, at Ruby Mae Thornton, holding her mother's hand. Something shifted in his expression, but he didn't speak. The night was growing colder now, edging past midnight and into the small hours. A few of the riders had started sharing thermoses of coffee. Someone had produced blankets from a saddlebag and brought them over to Claire and Ruby. Claire wrapped one around her daughter's shoulders gratefully. Ruby was tired, so tired her eyes kept trying to close. But she didn't want to sleep. Not yet, not until she knew everything was okay. Wyatt came back over and sat on the curb beside her. Hey, Ruby Mae, he said, you holding up? Ruby nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. Wyatt pulled something from his pocket, a deck of cards, worn and bent at the edges. You know any card tricks? Ruby shook her head. Well then, Wyatt said, I guess it's time you learned. He started showing her simple tricks, making cards disappear and reappear, letting her shuffle and deal. It was a distraction, something to keep her mind occupied while the adults talked in serious voices nearby. Ruby watched his hands move, watched the cards flip and dance, and for a little while she almost forgot to be scared. Mr. Wyatt, yeah, you said you were a Marine. Did you ever have to protect people? Wyatt's hand stilled. Yeah, he said quietly. I did. Were you scared? Every time. Ruby looked up at him. But you did it anyway. Yeah. Why? Wyatt thought about this. He thought about the mountains of Afghanistan, about the villages where children played in streets that could explode at any moment, about the weight of responsibility that came with wearing a uniform. He thought about Emily, about how he'd been overseas when she'd needed him most, about how he'd come home to a funeral instead of a sister. Because he said, finally, being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. It just means you're doing something that matters. Ruby absorbed this. You're brave, Mr. Wyatt. Wyatt smiled sadly. You're braver, Ruby Mae. You waited alone in the dark for over an hour and you didn't give up. That takes real courage. Ruby looked down at Patches, still clutched in her arms. Patches helped, she said. Then Patches is brave too. Ruby smiled just a little. The moment was broken by the sound of an engine. Not a motorcycle. Something heavier, louder, with a rumble that spoke of age and poor maintenance. Everyone turned. Down Oak Street, coming from the direction of Route 9, a dark green pickup truck appeared under the street lamps. It was moving slowly as if the driver was looking for something, or someone. Claire saw it and went rigid. That's him, she whispered. That's Derek. The truck rolled forward, and then the driver must have seen what was waiting for him. The police cruiser, the deputy, the sheriff, and 300 motorcycles lined up on both sides of the street like a gauntlet of chrome and steel. The truck stopped. Through the windshield, even at this distance, Sterling could see the shape of a man, could see him gripping the steering wheel, could see the moment he registered what he was looking at. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the truck's reverse lights came on. Kane, Hayes said sharply, but Kane was already moving. He ran to his cruiser, started the engine, and pulled out into the street, blocking the truck's retreat. Derek Vaughn's truck stopped again. Sterling stood up slowly, and behind him, 300 riders did the same. Not aggressive, not threatening. They simply stood, a wall of silent witnesses. The truck's door opened, and Derek Vaughn stepped out. He was a big man, probably in his mid-30s, with a heavy build and the kind of face that might have been handsome once, but had been hardened by years of anger and alcohol. He wore jeans and a stained white t-shirt. His eyes were red either from drinking or crying or both, and he was looking directly at Claire. "Claire," he shouted, his voice slurred. "Claire, baby, we need to..." Claire pressed Ruby behind her, putting her body between her daughter and this man. "Get back in your truck, Derek," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I just want to talk," Derek said, stumbling slightly as he walked forward. "Just talk, that's all. You can't keep avoiding me." Hayes stepped forward. "Mr. Vaughn, I'm Sheriff Colton Hayes. I need you to get back in your vehicle." Derek barely glanced at him. "This is between me and my girlfriend, old man. Stay out of it." "Ex-girlfriend," Claire said loudly. "We broke up 8 months ago, Derek. You need to leave." Derek's face twisted into something ugly. "You don't get to just leave me, Claire. We had something. You can't just throw that away." "You hit me," Claire said, and her voice rang out clear in the night air. "3 times. You got drunk and you hit me, and I have the hospital records to prove it." Ruby, standing there behind her mother, felt tears start to fall again. Not from fear this time, but from hearing her mother say out loud what Ruby had always known, but never fully understood. Derek took another step forward. "That's not fair. I was going through a rough time. I was stressed. You know I didn't mean it." "You meant it every time," Claire said. Hayes moved to intercept Derek, but the man was faster than he looked. He dodged around the sheriff and kept coming toward Claire. "Just let me explain," Derek said. "Just give me 5 minutes." He was 10 feet away now. Claire backed up, pulling Ruby with her. "Stay away from us." Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out a bottle, beer half empty. He took a drink and threw the bottle aside. It shattered on the pavement. "I'm not leaving without you," he said. And then something happened that Derek Vaughn had not anticipated. 300 men stepped forward. It was simultaneous, like a choreographed movement, though no signal had been given. Every single rider of the Iron Ridge Riders took one step forward, and the sound of 300 boots hitting pavement at once was like thunder. Derek stopped. He looked around, really looked, and for the first time seemed to comprehend what he had walked into. Sterling Reed walked forward until he was between Derek and Claire. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, arms at his sides, calm and immovable. Behind him, Wyatt Briggs stepped forward, then Hank Mercer, then another rider and another until there was a wall of leather and denim and quiet, absolute resolve standing between Derek Vaughn and the woman he had terrorized for 8 months. Derek's eyes went wide. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, but his voice had lost its confidence. Sterling spoke, his voice low and even. "This is 300 men who don't take kindly to bullies." Derek looked at him, trying to muster aggression. "This is none of your business. You made it our business when you came at a woman and her child." Derek's hands clenched into fists. "I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," Sterling said quietly. "But you don't have to be. All you have to do is get back in your truck and leave. Right now, and this ends here." "And if I don't..." Sterling didn't blink. "Then Deputy Kane arrests you for harassment, stalking, and whatever else he can make stick. And all 300 of us will be very happy to serve as witnesses." Derek looked past Sterling at Claire, desperation creeping into his expression. "Claire, please, just talk to me." Claire's voice came from behind the wall of riders, steady and clear. "I have nothing to say to you, Derek. It's over. It's been over, and if you ever come near me or my daughter again, I will make sure you go to jail. Derek's face flushed red. You can't do this to me. I already did, Claire said. Deputy Kane appeared at Derek's shoulder, handcuffs in hand. Mr. Vaughn, you're under arrest for violating a restraining order. Derek spun. What restraining order? There is no restraining order. There is now, Kane said. Miss Thornton filed for an emergency protective order 5 minutes ago, and given the circumstances, I'm authorized to enforce it immediately. Derek looked wildly from Kane to the bikers to Claire. This is bullshit. You can't do this. Kane grabbed Derek's arm. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. For a moment, it looked like Derek might fight. His muscles tensed, his jaw clenched, and Ruby felt her mother's grip on her hand tighten. But then Derek looked again at the 300 men standing silent witness, and whatever fight was in him drained away. He let Kane cuff him. As Kane walked Derek toward the cruiser, Derek shouted over his shoulder, "This isn't over, Claire, you hear me? This isn't over." But it was. Ruby could feel it in the way her mother's shoulders relaxed, in the way the riders parted to let Kane through with his prisoner. Sterling turned back to Claire. You okay, ma'am? Claire nodded, unable to speak. She was crying again, but these were different tears. Relief, gratitude. The kind of tears that come when a weight you've been carrying for so long finally lifts. Ruby stepped out from behind her mother and looked up at Sterling. You protected us, she said simply. Sterling crouched down. Yes, ma'am, we did. Ruby looked at all the riders, these big, intimidating men who had become her protectors. Thank you, she whispered. And then without planning to, without thinking about it, Ruby stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Sterling Reed's neck. Sterling froze for just a moment, and then his arms came up, and he held her gently, this tiny 7-year-old girl who had been through so much. You're safe now, Ruby May, he said, his voice rough. You're safe. Behind them, Wyatt Briggs turned away and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, thinking of Emily, wishing he could have been there for her, the way he'd been here for Ruby. Hank Mercer cleared his throat and looked up at the stars. 300 men, hard men, men who had seen war and loss and every kind of darkness the world could offer, stood in the street and felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Sheriff Colton Hayes watched all of this from where he stood by his truck. He watched Ruby hug Sterling. He watched Claire Thornton crying with relief. He watched 300 bikers who had transformed themselves into guardians. And he remembered. He remembered his son David, 23 years old, riding his motorcycle home from work on a rainy night in October. A car had run a red light. David hadn't had a chance. For 5 years, Hayes had blamed motorcycles, had blamed the culture, the machines, the very idea of riding. It was easier than blaming the drunk driver who had served only 18 months. Easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things happen to good people for no reason at all. He had looked at every biker as a threat, as a reminder of what he had lost. But tonight, watching Sterling Reed hold a frightened child, watching 300 men stand up to protect a woman they'd never met, Hayes understood something he had been refusing to see. His son would have been one of them. David, with his kind heart and his need to help people, would have absolutely been one of them. Hayes walked over to where Sterling was standing. Ruby had let go and was back with her mother, but Sterling remained waiting. The two men faced each other. Mr. Reed, Hayes said, "Yeshishilin." Sheriff. Hayes looked at the ground, at his boots, at anything but Sterling's eyes. I owe you an apology, he said finally. I came here tonight with assumptions. About you, about your men. I was wrong. Sterling said nothing, just waited. My son died on a motorcycle 5 years ago. Hayes continued, the words coming hard. And I blamed every rider I saw after that. It was easier than dealing with the grief. He finally looked up and met Sterling's eyes. But watching you tonight, watching what you did for that little girl, I realized something. My son would have done the same thing. He would have stopped. He would have helped. And he would have been proud to ride with men like you. Sterling's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss, Sheriff. Hayes nodded, his throat tight. Thank you. He extended his hand. Sterling looked at it for a long moment, then took it. They shook, and it was more than a handshake. It was an acknowledgement, a bridge built across grief and prejudice and misunderstanding. When they let go, Hayes turned to his deputy. Kane, make sure Ms. Thornton and her daughter get home safe. I want a unit watching their house for the rest of the night. Yes, sir. Hayes looked back at Sterling. You're free to go, and thank you for everything. Sterling nodded. The Iron Ridge riders began the slow process of departure. Helmets were retrieved. Engines were started one by one, warming up with that distinctive Harley rumble. Ruby stood with her mother watching. Claire bent down. Ruby, honey, we should go home now. But Ruby shook her head. Not yet, Mama. I need to say goodbye. She walked over to where Wyatt was standing by his bike. Mr. Wyatt. He turned and smiled down at her. Yeah, Ruby May. Thank you for the card tricks and for sitting with me. Wyatt crouched down. It was my honor, sweetheart. You take care of yourself, okay? Ruby hugged him quick and fierce. You too. She went to Hank Mercer next, and then to a dozen other riders, thanking each one, hugging some shaking hands with others. The men, these hard-weathered warriors, accepted her gratitude with gentle voices and careful hands. Finally, Ruby came to Sterling. He was standing by his Road King, his helmet in his hands, and he looked down at her with those pale blue eyes. Mr. Sterling. Yes, darling. Ruby held up Patches, the worn rabbit with his missing button eye. I want you to have him. Sterling's expression changed, something cracking in his careful composure. Ruby, I can't take your rabbit. Yes, you can, Ruby said, and there was certainty in her voice. My grandma gave him to me so I'd never be alone. But you stopped tonight because you don't want little girls to be alone. Patches should be with you, so you remember to keep stopping. Sterling looked at Claire, who had come to stand behind her daughter. Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. Sterling took Patches with hands that trembled slightly. Ruby May Thornton, he said, his voice thick. You are one of the bravest people I have ever met. Ruby stepped forward and hugged him one more time. You made me brave, Mr. Sterling. You sat down next to me when you could have kept going. That's what brave looks like. Sterling held her and the rabbit and felt something inside him that had been frozen for years begin to thaw. When Ruby stepped back, she saluted the way she'd seen soldiers do in movies. Sterling, surprised, saluted back. Then Ruby ran back to her mother and Claire scooped her up, holding her close. The engines revved. 300 motorcycles ready to roll. Sterling mounted his Road King, and as he did, he tied Patches to the handlebar mirror with a leather cord. The rabbit's one-button eye stared back at him, and Sterling found himself smiling. He looked at Ruby one last time. She waved, standing on the curb with her mother. Sterling waved back. Then he put on his helmet, kicked the stand, and rolled forward. Behind him, 300 riders followed. The roar of their engines filled the night, a sound like thunder. Like promise, like hope. Ruby watched them go, watched the river of lights disappear down Oak Street and onto Route 9, heading toward whatever came next. She watched until the last tail light faded. And even then, she could still hear them. The distant rumble of 300 engines growing fainter, but never quite disappearing. Claire kissed the top of her daughter's head. Come on, baby. Let's go home. Ruby nodded, but as they walked to their car, Ruby turned back one more time, looking at the empty street where just minutes before 300 guardians had stood. Goodbye, Thunder People, she whispered. And somewhere in the night, rolling toward Cookville with a worn rabbit tied to his handlebars, Sterling Reed heard her and smiled. The house on Cedar Lane was small, a one-story cottage with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged slightly on the left side. But it was home, and as Claire pulled the Honda into the driveway at 1:30 in the morning, Ruby had never been so happy to see it. Deputy Kane's cruiser pulled in behind them, his lights off now, just there as a presence, a promise that someone was watching. Claire carried Ruby inside, even though Ruby insisted she could walk. The house was dark and cool, untouched by the chaos of the night. Everything exactly as Claire had left it when she'd fled the diner hours ago, terrified and desperate. She set Ruby down gently in the living room. "Bath first," Claire said, "then bed." Ruby nodded, too tired to argue. While the water ran, Claire stood in the doorway and watched her daughter, this tiny brave soul who had survived a night that no 7-year-old should have to endure. Ruby sat on the edge of the tub, dangling her fingers in the water, and Claire felt her heart break and mend all at once. "Mama." "Yes, baby." "Are they really gone? The Thunder people?" Claire came and sat beside her daughter. "Yes, honey. They went to their rally, but they'll remember you. I promise they will." Ruby was quiet for a moment. "I gave Mr. Sterling my patches." Claire nodded. "I know. That was very brave of you. Grandma said patches would keep me safe, and he did. But now Mr. Sterling needs him more than me." Claire pulled Ruby into her arms. "When did you get so wise?" Ruby shrugged against her mother's shoulder. "I just know stuff sometimes." After the bath, after Ruby was in her pajamas with the faded unicorns, after Claire had tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead and promised that everything was going to be okay now. "Really okay?" Ruby spoke again. "Mama, are you going to be safe from Derek?" Claire smoothed Ruby's damp hair back from her face. "Yes, sweetheart. The police have him now, and I have a restraining order. If he comes near us again, he goes to jail." "Good," Ruby said fiercely. "He's a bad man." "He's a troubled man," Claire corrected gently. "But yes, what he did was wrong, and we don't have to be afraid of him anymore." Ruby's eyes were already closing. "The bikers weren't afraid of him." "No," Claire agreed, "they weren't, because there were 300 of them. That's part of it," Ruby yawned. "And because Mr. Sterling is brave, and Mr. Wyatt, and all of them." "Yes." Ruby's breathing began to even out, sleep finally claiming her. But just before she drifted off completely, she whispered one more thing. "I hope Mr. Sterling keeps patches forever." Claire stayed there sitting on the edge of Ruby's bed long after her daughter had fallen asleep. She stayed until the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, until Deputy Kane knocked softly on the door to tell her the next shift had arrived and he was heading home. And then Claire went to her own room and finally let herself cry. The days that followed were strange and quiet. Derek Vaughn was charged with stalking, harassment, and violating the emergency protective order. His bail was set high enough that he couldn't make it. He would sit in county jail until his trial, which gave Claire the first real peace she'd had in 8 months. Mrs. Ruth Caldwell came home from the hospital after 4 days weak but recovering. Claire visited her with Ruby, and the old woman wept when she saw them apologizing over and over for leaving Ruby alone. "I didn't even know what was happening," Ruth said, her voice thin and papery. "One moment I was watching the evening news, and the next I was waking up in the hospital." Claire held her hand. "It's not your fault, Ruth. None of this is your fault." Ruby climbed up onto the bed and hugged Mrs. Caldwell carefully. "I'm glad you're okay," Ruby said, "and I'm sorry you were sick." Ruth kissed the top of Ruby's head. "You're a brave girl, Ruby May. Braver than any little girl should have to be." The story of what had happened that night on Oak Street spread through Pinewood like wildfire. At first, there were the usual small-town whispers, exaggerations, rumors. 300 bikers had threatened the sheriff. A little girl had been kidnapped and rescued. Derek Vaughn had pulled a gun. None of it was true, but truth rarely mattered in the first telling. Then Deputy King gave an interview to the local paper. He told the real story. A 7-year-old girl lost and alone. 300 men who stopped to help. A woman running from an abusive ex. A community that had failed to see what was happening until it was almost too late. The article ran on the front page with a photo of Oak Street empty now, but still somehow charged with the memory of what had happened there. Within hours, someone had posted the article to Facebook. It spread quickly through Pinewood, then to surrounding towns, then across Tennessee. People shared it with comments like, "This restores my faith in humanity," and "Not all heroes wear capes," and "These are the real men." The story gained traction. A local TV station picked it up, then a regional one. By the end of the week, the video had over 2 million views. People from across the country were commenting, sharing their own stories of bikers who had helped them, thanking the Iron Ridge Riders by name. The tone in town began to shift. People who had called the police that night in fear started to feel something else. Shame, maybe, or regret. They had looked at the Iron Ridge Riders and seen only what they expected to see. Danger, threat, outsiders. They hadn't seen the truth. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the 82-year-old woman who lived 2 houses down from Oak Street, came to visit Claire and Ruby a week after that night. She brought a pie apple with a lattice crust and an apology. "I called the police," she said, standing on Claire's porch, her hands twisting the handles of her purse. "When I saw all those motorcycles, I was frightened, and I called, and I am so ashamed." Claire invited her in. They sat in the small living room while Ruby colored at the coffee table, and Mrs. Pritchard told them about her grandson who had died in Iraq in 2007, how he'd been a Marine, how he would have been exactly the kind of man to stop and help a child in need. "Those riders," she said, her voice breaking, "they reminded me of him, and I was too scared to see it until it was over." Ruby looked up from her coloring. "It's okay, Mrs. Pritchard. My mama says everybody makes mistakes. You just have to say sorry and do better." The old woman looked at this tiny, wise child and began to cry. But the most significant change came from Sheriff Colton Hayes. 3 days after that night, he called a town meeting at the Pinewood Community Center. Nearly 200 people showed up, curious and concerned. Hayes stood at the front of the room, his uniform crisp, his expression serious. "I want to talk about what happened last Tuesday night," he said, "and I want to talk about the assumptions I made, that we all made." He told them about the Iron Ridge Riders, about the fact that 62% of them were veterans, about their history, their purpose, their code. He told them about Sterling Reed, who had sat down on a curb next to a frightened child instead of riding past. He told them about his own son, David, and how grief had twisted his perception for 5 years. And then he said something that no one expected. "I'm proposing that the town of Pinewood formally thank the Iron Ridge Riders for their service to our community that night. And I'm proposing that we make a donation to their Veteran Support Fund in the amount of $5,000. The room erupted in discussion. Some people agreed immediately. Others were hesitant. A few were outright opposed. But when the vote was taken, it passed, overwhelmingly. Claire Thornton, sitting in the back row with Ruby on her lap, felt tears slip down her cheeks. The letter went out the next week addressed to Sterling Reed, Chapter President, Iron Ridge Riders, Knoxville, Tennessee. It was signed by Sheriff Hayes and 43 residents of Pinewood, including Claire and Ruby, who had carefully written her name in careful second-grade letters at the bottom. The letter thanked them, honored them, invited them to return anytime, and it included a check for $5,000. 3 weeks after that night, Claire received a letter in return. The envelope was thick, hand-addressed in careful block letters. Inside was a handwritten note on lined paper. "Dear Ms. Thornton and Ruby May, thank you for your letter and for the donation which we have put toward our Veteran Emergency Assistance Fund. It will help a lot of men who need it. I want you to know that Ruby May taught me something that night about courage and kindness and what it means to do the right thing. I hope you are both safe and well. I hope Derek Vaughn stays far away from you. And I hope Ruby May knows that she has 318 brothers who will always be there if she needs us. Patches is doing fine. He rides with me everywhere now, with respect and gratitude. Sterling Reed." Folded inside the letter was a photograph. It showed Sterling Reed standing next to his Road King motorcycle. He was wearing his leather vest and sunglasses, and tied to his handlebar mirror was Patches the worn rabbit, with his missing button eye fluttering slightly in what must have been a breeze. Ruby held the photograph like it was made of glass. "He kept him," she whispered. "He really kept him." Claire hugged her daughter close. "Of course he did. You gave him something precious. He's not going to let that go." Ruby asked if she could write back, and Claire said yes. That evening at the kitchen table, Ruby carefully composed her response. Claire helped with the spelling, but the words were all Ruby's. Dear Mr. Sterling, thank you for keeping Patches safe. I knew you would. I am doing good. Mama is doing good too. The bad man is still in jail, and Deputy Kane says he will stay there for a long time. I think about you and Mr. Wyatt and all the Thunder people a lot. I tell my friends at school about the night you came. Some of them don't believe me, but I know it's true. I hope you keep stopping for people who need help. You are very good at it. Love, Ruby Mae Thornton. P.S. Patches says hello. The letters continued. Once a month, sometimes more. Ruby would write to Sterling, and Sterling would write back. He told her about the rallies they attended, the roads they rode, the people they helped. He sent photographs of Patches in different places. Patches at the Grand Canyon, Patches in front of a sunset in New Mexico, Patches at a Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Ruby kept every photo in a shoebox under her bed, and slowly, month by month, something else began to happen in Pinewood. Claire, with the help of Sheriff Hayes and several other community members, opened a support center for women fleeing domestic violence. They called it Thunder House, and they painted a small motorcycle on the sign. It started in the basement of the Baptist church, just a few chairs and a coffee pot and a phone number that women could call when they needed help. But it grew. Donations came in. Volunteers stepped forward. Within 6 months, Thunder House had helped 12 women and their children find safety. Sheriff Hayes worked there one evening a week, answering phones and doing intake interviews. He said it helped him feel like he was honoring his son's memory in a way that mattered. Deputy Kane became the town's domestic violence liaison, specially trained to handle cases like Claire's. He made sure that women who came forward were heard, were believed, were protected. And every few months, a check would arrive from Knoxville, Tennessee, always for exactly $500. Always with the same note, for Thunder House, keep up the good work. Iron Ridge Riders, Ruby grew. She turned 8, then 9, then 10. She got taller, her face lost some of its roundness, her voice grew stronger. But she never forgot that night. When she was 12 years old, her 7th grade English teacher assigned a personal essay. The topic was a moment that changed my life. Ruby wrote about July 23, 2024, about sitting on a curb at 11 o'clock at night alone and scared, about the roar of 300 engines, about a man named Sterling Reed who sat down beside her and promised to find her mother. She wrote about courage and kindness and what it means to protect people who can't protect themselves. The essay was beautiful and raw and honest, and when Ruby read it aloud in class, 3 students cried. Her teacher entered it in a state writing competition. Ruby won. The prize was a $500 scholarship and publication in a statewide anthology of student writing. But more than that, the essay went viral. It was picked up by a local news station, then a regional one, then a national one. Within 2 weeks, The Night the Thunder Came had been read by more than 20 million people. Messages poured in from women who had been in abusive relationships, from veterans who had served and struggled to find purpose afterward, from people who had been judged unfairly and found hope in Ruby's words, and from bikers. Thousands of bikers from all over the country who said that Ruby Mae Thornton had given voice to something they had been trying to explain for years, that they were not what people assumed, that they were fathers and brothers and sons, that they were protectors. Sterling Reed called the house the day after the essay went viral. Ruby answered, and when she heard his voice, she started to cry. Mr. Sterling. Hey there, Ruby Mae. I read your essay. Did you like it? Sterling's voice was thick with emotion. Like it, darling. I think it might be the most important thing I've ever read. They talked for an hour about the essay, about school, about life. Sterling told her about the messages he'd been getting from people all over the country, about how her words had changed minds and hearts. You did something special. Ruby Mae, he said, you told the truth, and the truth matters. Before they hung up, Sterling asked her a question. Ruby, how would you feel about coming to our next rally, you and your mama, as our guests of honor? Ruby's breath caught. Really? Really? I think it's time you met the whole family. That summer, when Ruby was 12 and a half, Claire drove them to Cookeville, Tennessee for the Iron Ridge Riders annual rally. They arrived on a Friday evening, and what Ruby saw took her breath away. More than 1,000 motorcycles filled the rally grounds. Tents and booths and stages. Music and laughter and the constant rumble of engines. And standing at the entrance, waiting for them, was Sterling Reed. He looked older than Ruby remembered. More gray in his beard, more lines around his eyes. But when he saw her, his face broke into a smile that erased the years. "Ruby Mae Thornton," he said. "Look at you, all grown up." Ruby ran to him and hugged him with the same fierce intensity she had shown at 7 years old. Sterling held her in Patches, who he had brought with him, worn and faded but still intact after 5 years of riding. "I brought him to see you," Sterling said, handing the rabbit to Ruby. Ruby held Patches and felt like she was holding a piece of her own history. That weekend was one of the best of Ruby's life. She met Wyatt Briggs, who still had the same kind eyes and who taught her how to throw a proper punch just in case. She met Hank Mercer and his 3 daughters, who welcomed her like a sister. She met dozens of riders who had been there that night and hundreds more who had heard the story and wanted to meet the brave little girl who had changed so many minds. On Saturday night, there was a ceremony. Sterling stood on a stage in front of more than 1,000 people and told the story of July 23rd, 2024. He told it simply and honestly the way it had happened, and then he invited Ruby to join him. She walked up on stage, her mother beside her, and looked out at a sea of leather and chrome and weathered faces. Sterling handed her a leather vest. It was small, made specifically for her, with patches that read "Honorary Iron Ridge Rider" and "Thunder's Daughter." "Ruby Mae Thornton," Sterling said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "You are now and forever a part of this family. We ride for you. We protect in your name. And we will never forget what you taught us about courage." The crowd erupted in applause. And then one by one, every single rider stood. More than 1,000 men and women standing in honor of a 12-year-old girl who had once sat alone on a curb and waited for hope to arrive. Ruby wore the vest for the rest of the weekend and for years afterward. It hung in her closet through high school, a reminder of who she was and what she had survived. The years continued to pass. Ruby turned 13, 14, 15. She grew into a young woman with her mother's brown hair and her own fierce spirit. She volunteered at Thunder House. She spoke at domestic violence awareness events. She never forgot where she came from or who had helped her get here. Sterling and Ruby continued to write. The letters became emails, then text messages, but the connection never faded. When Ruby was 16, Sterling came to Pinewood for the first time since that night in 2024. He came alone on his Road King with patches still tied to the handlebar mirror. He met Ruby at the corner of Oak Street and Route 9. She was waiting for him there, standing on the same curb where she had waited all those years ago. Sterling pulled up, cut the engine, and removed his helmet. They looked at each other across the years in the distance, and all that had changed. And then Sterling did what he had done the first time. He sat down on the curb. Ruby sat beside him just like she had at 7 years old. "You kept your promise," she said. "Which one?" "All of them." They sat there for a long time, watching the traffic pass, listening to the sounds of Pinewood going about its evening. "I'm going to college," Ruby said. "Social work. I want to help people like Mama, like me." Sterling nodded. "You'll be good at that. Because you taught me how." Sterling looked at her. "Ruby Mae, I didn't teach you anything. You already knew. You just needed someone to sit down next to you and believe in you." Ruby leaned against his shoulder. "Then that's what I'll do. I'll sit down next to people and believe in them." Sterling put his arm around her cis girl, who had become like a daughter to him, and felt the kind of peace that comes from knowing you did something right. The time came for Ruby to graduate high school. She was valedictorian, just like she dreamed. Her speech was about second chances and chosen family, and the power of showing up when people need you most. And sitting in the front row, invited by Ruby herself, were Sterling Reed and Wyatt Briggs, and Hank Mercer and 27 other Iron Ridge riders who had been there that night in 2024. They wore their vests and their colors, and they stood and applauded when Ruby walked across the stage louder and longer than anyone else. After the ceremony in the parking lot, Sterling presented Ruby with a gift. It was Patches. The rabbit had been carefully restored. His torn ear had been sewn. His missing button eye had been replaced with a new one, shiny and black. His fur had been cleaned and brushed, but he was still Patches, still worn, still loved. "He's been with me for 11 years, Sterling said, through every state, every rally, every mile. But he belongs with you now, Ruby May. You're the brave one. You always were." Ruby took Patches with trembling hands. She held him the way she had at 7 years old, clutched to her chest like he was the only solid thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for stopping, for staying, for believing in me." Sterling pulled her into a hug. "No, darling, thank you. You saved me just as much as I saved you." They stood there in the parking lot surrounded by 300 motorcycles and 1,000 memories, and Ruby understood something she had known in her heart for years. Family wasn't just blood. It was who showed up. It was who sat down beside you in the dark. It was who promised to find you and meant it. That night, the Iron Ridge Riders escorted Ruby home from her graduation. All 28 of them engines, roaring lights blazing, forming an honor guard through the streets of Pinewood. People came out of their houses to watch. They lined the sidewalks, and they waved, and they cheered because this town had learned slowly and painfully what it meant to judge too quickly and how much you could miss when you did. Ruby rode in the car with her mother, and she held Patches, and she felt like the luckiest person in the world. The escort ended as it had to at the corner of Oak Street and Route 9. The bikes pulled up, engines rumbling, and then one by one they fell silent. Sterling dismounted and walked over to Ruby's car. She rolled down the window. "This is where it started," he said, gesturing to the curb. "I know," Ruby said. "You were 7 years old, sitting right there holding a rabbit with a missing eye. And you sat down next to me." Sterling smiled. "Best decision I ever made." Ruby got out of the car. She stood on the curb, 17 now, about to go off to college, about to start her life. But for this moment, she was 7 again, and scared and alone. Except she wasn't alone. She had never been alone. Not since the night the thunder came. "Mr. Sterling." "Yes, Ruby May." "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll keep stopping for other kids who need it, other people who are scared and alone." Sterling looked at her, this remarkable young woman who had taught him what strength really looked like. "I promise," he said, "on my honor, for as long as I'm riding." Ruby hugged him one more time, and then the Iron Ridge Riders started their engines and the sound filled the night, thunder rolling across the Tennessee sky. They rode out of Pinewood, heading back to Knoxville, to Cookeville, to wherever the road would take them next. But Sterling Reed looked in his rearview mirror and saw Ruby May Thornton standing on that curb waving, and he knew that some journeys never really end. Some journeys just circle back again and again to remind you why you started in the first place. Ruby went to college that fall. She studied social work and psychology and everything she could learn about helping people in crisis. She kept Patches on her dorm room bed. She kept the leather vest in her closet. She kept every letter, every photo, every memory of that night when 300 strangers became family. And when she graduated with her master's degree 4 years later, Sterling Reed was there again. Older now, his beard almost completely gray, but still strong, still riding, still showing up. After the ceremony, they stood together in the same parking lot where he had returned Patches to her years before. "I'm opening a shelter," Ruby told him, "a bigger version of Thunder House, for women and children fleeing violence. I want to call it Reed House, after you." Sterling's eyes went bright. "Ruby May, I don't deserve that." "Yes, you do," she said firmly. "You sat down when you could have kept going. You stayed when you could have left. You protected us when no one else would. That's what Reed House will do. We'll sit down, we'll stay, we'll protect." Sterling looked at this extraordinary woman who had once been a frightened child on a curb. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice breaking. "Prouder than I can say." Ruby took his hand. "I wouldn't be here without you." "You would," Sterling said. "You were always going to be here, Ruby May. You were always going to do something special. I just got to be there when it started." They stood together watching the sun set over the campus, and Ruby felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. The fear, the waiting, the hope, the roar of 300 engines. A man sitting down on a curb. A promise kept. Reed House opened in Pinewood, Tennessee on July 23, 2035. Exactly 11 years after that night on Oak Street, Ruby Mae Thornton, 25 years old now, stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony and looked out at the crowd. Her mother was there. Sheriff Hayes, retired now but still volunteering. Deputy Kane. Mrs. Ruth Caldwell, 93, and frail but determined to be present. And the Iron Ridge Riders. 243 of them had made the ride to Pinewood for this day. Sterling Reed at the front, patches still tied to his motorcycle, now 16 years old, and barely holding together but still there, still riding. Ruby gave a speech about hope and healing and second chances, and then she invited Sterling to cut the ribbon with her. They stood together, scissors in hand, and the cameras flashed and the crowd applauded. But what mattered most was the look they shared. Understanding, gratitude, love. The love between a girl who had needed someone to stop and a man who had. As the ribbon fell away and people flooded into Reed House to see what Ruby had built, Sterling pulled her aside. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. Ruby looked at him and saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. "What is it?" Sterling took a breath. "I'm sick, Ruby May, cancer. The doctors say I've got maybe a year if I'm lucky." The world seemed to tilt. "No," Ruby whispered. "No, you can't." "Hey," Sterling said, gently pulling her into a hug. "It's okay. I've had a good ride, a long one, and I got to see you grow up. Got to see you do this. That's more than most men get." Ruby was crying now hard, the way she had cried at 7 years old when she thought no one was coming. "I need you," she said. "Reed House needs you. I can't do this without you." Sterling held her tighter. "Yes, you can. You've been doing it without me for years. I just got to watch." He pulled back and looked at her, wiping tears from her cheeks with his rough, tattooed hands. "Ruby Mae Thornton, you are the strongest, bravest, kindest person I know. You don't need me anymore. But I'm going to be here as long as I can, for every day I have left. I promise." And he was. Sterling Reed spent his last year riding between Knoxville and Pinewood, helping at Reed House, mentoring the women and children who came through its doors, showing them what it looked like when someone chose to protect instead of harm. He told them about a 7-year-old girl on a curb who had taught him what courage really meant. He showed them patches barely holding together, now stitched and restitched. So many times he was more thread than fabric. He sat with them the way he had sat with Ruby, and he listened and he believed them, and he helped them find their way to safety. Ruby was with him when he died. It was April 2036, and Sterling was in hospice in Knoxville. The Iron Ridge Riders had gathered, filling the parking lot with motorcycles, a constant vigil. Ruby sat by his bed holding his hand, and Patches sat on the nightstand where Sterling could see him. "Ruby Mae," Sterling whispered, his voice thin, now worn down by pain and medication. "I'm here," she said. "That night," he said, "on Oak Street, when I saw you sitting there crying holding that rabbit, do you know what I thought?" "What?" "I thought there's a little girl who needs someone to stop. And if I don't stop, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Ruby squeezed his hand. "I'm so glad you stopped." Sterling smiled just a little. "Me too, darling. Me too." His eyes closed. "Keep riding," he whispered. "Keep stopping. Keep helping." "I will," Ruby promised. "I swear I will." Sterling Reed took his last breath holding Ruby Mae Thornton's hand the way he had held it 11 years ago on a curb in Pinewood, Tennessee. And outside, 243 motorcycles started their engines, and the sound rolled across Knoxville like thunder. Like a salute. like a promise that the ride would continue even though the rider was gone. Ruby kept her promise. Reed House expanded. Within 5 years, there were 3 locations across Tennessee. Within 10 years, 12 across the South. Every single one was staffed by people who understood what it meant to need help and to receive it. Who knew that sometimes the most important thing you could do was sit down next to someone and say, I'm here. Ruby never stopped volunteering. Even as Reed House grew and she could have stepped back, she didn't. She worked intake. She answered phones. She sat with frightened women and children, and she told them about a night when 300 strangers became family, and she kept patches. He sat in a glass case in the main lobby of every Reed House location. Beneath him, a plaque read, "This rabbit belonged to Ruby Mae Thornton, who was 7 years old when she learned that courage means sitting alone on a curb and waiting for help to come." It was carried for 16 years by Sterling Reed, who learned that courage means stopping when you could keep going. May we all have the courage to wait and the courage to stop. Every year on July 23rd, the Iron Ridge Riders rode to Pinewood. It became a tradition, the Thunder Ride they called it. They would gather at sunrise, hundreds of motorcycles, and they would ride to Oak Street. They would park in formation just like that night in 2024, and they would stand in silence for 300 seconds. 1 second for each rider who had stopped. And then Ruby would speak. She would tell the story because stories matter, and truth matters, and people need to hear about the times when strangers chose to be heroes. She would talk about Sterling Reed and Wyatt Briggs and Hank Mercer and all the men and women who had shown her what it meant to protect the vulnerable. And she would end the same way every year. If you see someone alone and scared and in need, stop. Just stop. Sit down beside them. Tell them they're not alone. You might save a life. You might save a soul. You might change everything. The Thunder Ride became famous. News crews came to cover it. Magazines wrote articles. People traveled from across the country to be part of it. But Ruby never forgot what it was really about. It was about a 7-year-old girl who waited and a man who stopped. Everything else was just details. On July 23rd, 2054, 30 years after that night, Ruby Mae Thornton stood on the corner of Oak Street and Route 9 for the annual Thunder Ride. She was 37 years old now. Her hair had streaks of gray. Her face had lines that spoke of years spent helping others carry their burdens. But her eyes were still the same green they had been at 7, still fierce, still kind. 300 motorcycles were parked in formation. But these weren't the original riders. Most of them were gone now, passed away, or too old to ride. These were their children, their grandchildren, people who had heard the story and wanted to be part of the legacy. Wyatt Briggs was there, 61 now, his red hair gone gray, but still riding, still stopping, still helping. And standing next to Ruby was a 7-year-old girl. Her name was Sterling, named after the man who had changed Ruby's life. She was Ruby's daughter, adopted from Reed House 3 years ago, a child who had needed someone to stop and say, I'll keep you safe. Little Sterling held a stuffed rabbit, new and bright, with both button eyes intact. Ruby had given it to her on the day the adoption was finalized. This is Thunder, Ruby had told her daughter. He's going to keep you safe, just like Patches kept me safe. Now, as the ceremony began, little Sterling looked up at her mother. Mama, tell me the story again. Ruby smiled. She had told this story 1,000 times, 10,000, to strangers and friends and daughters and anyone who would listen, and she would tell it 10,000 more, because some stories need to be told, again and again and again, until everyone knows that courage looks like sitting down, that family means showing up, that sometimes the thunder comes when you need it most. Ruby knelt down next to her daughter there on the curb where she had sat 30 years ago, and she began. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who was lost and alone and scared. And she sat on this very curb, and she waited because her mama had taught her that when you're lost, you stand still and you wait for help to find you. Sterling listened, her eyes wide. And then she heard a sound, a roar like thunder. And out of the darkness came 300 motorcycles, and one man sat down beside her and said, we're going to find her. Ruby looked at the assembled riders at Wyatt, at the legacy that Sterling Reed had left behind. And that man kept his promise. And because he stopped that night, hundreds of people have been saved. Thousands. Because one person chose to sit down instead of ride past. Little Sterling hugged her rabbit. Was he brave, Mama? The bravest, Ruby said. As brave as you. Ruby smiled through the tears that always came when she told this story. Braver, because he taught me what brave looked like. The engine started then, 300 of them, the annual salute. The sound rolled across Pinewood like thunder, like promise, like hope. And Ruby Mae Thornton stood on that curb with her daughter, and she felt Sterling Reed's presence as clearly as if he were standing right beside her. She looked at the spot where he had sat down all those years ago, and she whispered, "Thank you for everything, for stopping." The thunder rolled on, and somewhere in whatever place brave men go, when they've finished their ride, Sterling Reed smiled and tied a worn rabbit to his handlebars and kept riding, kept stopping, kept being the man who sat down when a child needed him. Because some promises are forever, and some thunder never fades. It just changes form, from motorcycles to shelter walls, from engines to heartbeats, from strangers to family. And that night 30 years ago when 300 men stopped for one little girl wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of hope, of healing, of home, the beginning of everything that mattered. And as the sun set over Pinewood, Tennessee, and the thunder ride prepared to depart, Ruby held her daughter close and knew with absolute certainty that Sterling Reed's legacy would live on. Not in monuments or statues, but in every person who chose to stop. Every stranger who chose to help. Every soul who sat down beside someone in the dark and said simply and truly, "I'm here." The thunder rolled out of Pinewood that night, heading toward whatever came next. But it would always come back, because that's what thunder does. It reminds you of its power. It shakes you awake. It tells you that sometimes the most ordinary night can become the most extraordinary story. If only someone is brave enough to stop.